There is an island off the coast of Rio de Janeiro that locals once called the Devil's Cauldron. It sits about 90 miles southwest of the city, surrounded by water so green it almost looks peaceful. But for more than a century, Ilha Grande was anything but. It was a place where the Brazilian state sent the people it wanted the world to forget: the sick, the political inconvenient, and eventually, the criminal. And it was inside the crumbling walls of its most notorious prison that one of the most powerful and enduring organized crime networks in the Western Hemisphere was born. This is the story of the Red Command, in Portuguese, the Comando Vermelho, a story that begins not with a gun, not with a drug deal, but with a political decision made by a military dictatorship that had no idea what it was setting in motion. To understand what happened on Ilha Grande, you have to understand the world that existed long before the first prisoner ever set foot there. Rio de Janeiro in the 19th century was a city being pulled in two directions at once. On one side, there was the grand imperial ambition, the palaces, the boulevards, the illusion of a European metropolis transplanted to the tropics. On the other, there was the grinding, inescapable reality of poverty. When the Portuguese royal family arrived in 1808, fleeing Napoleon's invasion of Lisbon, they brought with them an entire colonial apparatus that concentrated wealth and power in the hands of a tiny elite. Everyone else, enslaved Africans, freed people with nowhere to go, migrants from the interior, crowded into dense, airless tenements called cortiços in the heart of the city. The abolition of slavery in 1888 changed the legal status of hundreds of thousands of people. It did almost nothing else. There were no land grants, no economic programs, no path to integration. And so, the formerly enslaved and the landless poor began to do what people with no options have always done throughout history. They built their own places to live, on the hillsides and the margins, in the spaces the city didn't want. The first favela is traditionally dated to 1897, when veterans of the brutal Canudos War, soldiers who had been promised land and received nothing, occupied a hill in central Rio and named it after a tough, thorny plant from the Brazilian backlands. Over the following decades, the favelas multiplied. City authorities tried everything except actually solving the underlying problem. They demolished tenements, which simply pushed people further up the hills. They declared favelas illegal, which simply made their residents more invisible. They ignored, bulldozed, and occasionally set fire to communities. And through all of it, the favelas kept growing, because the forces driving people into them never went away. By the time the military coup of 1964 installed a dictatorship that would last more than 2 decades, the favelas of Rio de Janeiro housed hundreds of thousands of people. People who worked in the city's homes, factories, and construction sites, but who returned at night to communities that received none of the city's investment and all of its contempt. The dictatorship's approach to the favelas was, if anything, more organized than what came before. It launched mass removal campaigns, relocating entire communities to distant housing projects on the outskirts of the city. Places like Cidade de Deus, City of God, were built not to integrate the poor into urban life, but to move them further away from it, to the periphery where they would be less visible and, the planners hoped, less troublesome. It did not work out that way. Now, while all of this was happening above ground in the streets of Rio, something else was happening below the surface, in the prison system, and particularly on Ilha Grande. The island had been a quarantine station since the 1880s, a place where the Brazilian government held arriving immigrants who might be carrying disease. It became a prison in 1897, and for the next several decades, it served as a dumping ground for those the state most wanted to isolate. Common criminals, yes, but also political prisoners, anarchists, communists, labor organizers, anyone who challenged the established order. The prison that would become the center of our story, the Instituto Penal Cândido Mendes, was a place of almost unimaginable brutality. By 1979, it held 1,284 people in a facility designed for roughly 540. There was not enough food. There was not enough water. Medical care was essentially non-existent. Prisoners slept in shifts because there were not enough beds. Violence was constant. Between prisoners and guards, sometimes simply as a function of the sheer, grinding desperation of daily life. People who survived described it as a place where your humanity was stripped away one day at a time. The military dictatorship that took power in 1964 saw the prison as useful for a particular purpose. It had a problem: political prisoners, guerrillas, leftist militants, students, intellectuals, people who had taken up armed resistance against the regime. These were educated, organized individuals who had training in clandestine operations, in building cells and networks, in maintaining discipline under pressure. Keeping them together in one place created a risk that they would continue to organize.
The solution, as the dictatorship saw it, was to mix them with common criminals, contaminate the political prisoners with the chaos of ordinary prison life, surround them with violence and desperation until their ideology dissolved, strip away the solidarity. It was one of the most consequential miscalculations in Brazilian history, because what actually happened was almost the precise opposite. The political prisoners did not lose their organizational discipline. Instead, they shared it. In the suffocating heat of the island prison, in the dormitories and the workyards and the cramped spaces where men spent years trying not to lose their minds, something remarkable occurred. The guerrillas and the bank robbers began to talk to each other. The political prisoners introduced concepts that the common criminals had never encountered in any formal way. Ideas about collective action, about the power of solidarity, about how a group of people with a common interest could organize themselves to protect and advance that interest. They brought books, which circulated secretly through the prison population. They talked about strategy, and the men they talked to were not fools. They were people who had grown up in the favelas, who had spent their lives navigating systems designed to grind them down, who understood power and violence and survival in ways the guerrillas never quite could.
The exchange went both ways, and what emerged from it was something neither group had entirely planned. By the mid-1970s, the prison population had organized itself into groups called phalanges, factions, roughly, though the word carries a more martial connotation. These weren't gangs in the conventional sense. They were something more structured. Territorial organizations built around shared origin, whether from the same neighborhood, the same part of the city, or the same criminal specialty. There was the Falange do Jacaré, named for a neighborhood in the North Zone. There was the Falange da Zona Sul. There were others, smaller and less defined. And then there was the Falange LSN. LSN stood for Lei de Segurança Nacional, the National Security Law. That law was the primary legal instrument of the dictatorship's repression, the statute under which political prisoners were charged and imprisoned. The common criminals who took this name were making a deliberate statement. They saw themselves as facing the same enemy as the political prisoners. The enemy was the state. The Falange LSN occupied the harshest section of the Ilha Grande facility, the area reserved for the most dangerous prisoners, where temperatures were extreme and conditions were worst. It was there, in the pressure cooker of that section, that the foundational ideas of what would become the Red Command were forged. The proposal was radical in its simplicity. Stop killing each other. Stop stealing from each other. Create rules that all members had to follow. If someone violated those rules, they faced internal punishment. But the punishment would be decided collectively, not by whoever happened to be strongest in the moment. The fundamental logic was this: the enemy is not the man sleeping next to you. The enemy is the system that put you both here. In 1979, the tensions between factions inside Ilha Grande came to a head in a night of extreme violence. The Falange LSN emerged victorious, eliminating or absorbing its rivals. In the aftermath, the surviving leadership made the organization official. They gave it a new name, first the Falange Vermelha, the Red Faction, and then, in a further evolution, the Comando Vermelho,
the Red Command. The founders were three men whose names would become central to any understanding of organized crime in Brazil. The first was William da Silva Lima, known as the Professor, O Professor. He was, by all accounts, the intellectual architect of the organization, the man most directly influenced by his contact with the political prisoners and most committed to the idea that the Red Command should operate by something resembling principles, not just raw power. He later wrote a memoir about his experience, one of the rare insider accounts of what actually happened in those years. The second was Rogério Lemgruber, known as Bagulhão. He was the organizational spine, the man who understood how to translate ideas into structures, how to build systems that could survive the arrest or death of any individual member. The third was José Carlos dos Reis Ensina, known as Escadinha, Little Staircase. He was younger than the others, charismatic, fearless, and possessed of a quality that is almost impossible to teach, the ability to inspire loyalty. Where the Professor and Bagulhão provided the ideology and the structure, Escadinha provided the face. He would become, in the 1980s, the closest thing the Red Command had to a public figure, celebrated in the favelas, hunted by the police, and eventually the subject of one of the most audacious prison escapes in Brazilian history. But all of that was still in the future. In 1979, on an island prison 90 miles from Rio de Janeiro, the Red Command was simply trying to survive. The first achievement of the new organization was internal. By imposing a code of conduct, prohibiting theft and violence between members, establishing mechanisms for resolving disputes, it created something that had never existed before in that prison: relative stability. Prisoners under the Red Command's authority knew what to expect from each other. That predictability was enormously valuable in an environment where unpredictability was the primary source of danger. The second achievement was financial. The organization created what members called the Caixinha, the little box, a collective fund. Members contributed to it from whatever resources they had. In return, the fund helped pay for lawyers, for bribes to guards, for support to prisoners' families on the outside, and eventually for something more operationally significant: planning escapes. The third achievement, the one that would ultimately matter most, was ideological. The Red Command gave its members an identity. It told them that they were not simply failures who had ended up in the worst place imaginable by random chance. It told them that they were part of something, that they had obligations to each other, and that the system which had put them there was the actual criminal. Whatever the accuracy of that analysis, its power was undeniable. Men who had been isolated and humiliated found, for the first time, that they belonged somewhere. The organization's motto was three words: paz, justiça e liberdade. Peace, justice, and liberty. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. An organization that would eventually become one of the most powerful drug trafficking networks in South America announced itself to the world under the banner of peace, justice, and liberty. The tension between that stated ideology and the actual trajectory of the organization is one of the central questions that scholars and investigators have debated ever since. Some argue that the ideological framing was always cynical, a thin veneer of political legitimacy over what was fundamentally a criminal enterprise from the beginning. Others argue that the early founders were genuinely shaped by their contact with the political prisoners, and that the transformation into a drug cartel was not inevitable, but resulted from specific choices made by specific people in specific circumstances. What is beyond dispute is that by the early 1980s, the Red Command had outgrown Ilha Grande. Its members were on the streets of Rio de Janeiro, and they were changing the city. The transition from a prison-based organization to a street organization happened in stages. The Caixinha, which had originally been designed to fund legal expenses and bribes, was redirected toward funding criminal operations. Members who had been released from prison, or who had escaped, maintained their connections to the organization and began operating in the favelas. The first major test of the Red Command's street presence came in a confrontation involving a member named José Jorge Saldanha, known as Zé do Bigode. A police operation to arrest him turned into a standoff lasting roughly 12 hours, involving a large number of officers and resulting in significant casualties. The message was unmistakable. This was not the kind of criminal organization the police had dealt with before. These men were organized, armed, disciplined, and prepared. In 1982, the Red Command made what would prove to be the decisive strategic shift of its existence. It entered the drug trade. The timing was not accidental. The early 1980s saw an enormous expansion in the availability of cocaine throughout South America, as Colombian producers looked for new markets and new routes. Brazil, with its vast territory, its long and porous borders, and its enormous urban population concentrated in cities with large informal economies, was an obvious target. The favelas of Rio de Janeiro were, from a purely logistical standpoint, ideal distribution points. Densely populated, poorly policed, and full of people who needed economic opportunity. The Red Command saw this and moved. The transition was not entirely smooth. There were those within the organization who were uncomfortable with the shift toward drugs, who saw it as a betrayal of the founding principles. But the economics were overwhelming. Drug trafficking generated revenues that made bank robbery look modest by comparison. It allowed the organization to arm itself at a level that gave it genuine military capability. And it gave it something even more important: a permanent economic relationship with the communities where it operated. By 1985, the Red Command controlled roughly 70% of the retail drug trade in Rio de Janeiro. In the favelas, this control manifested not just as domination, but as something more complex. The organization provided things that the state had never provided to these communities: security from outside threats, dispute resolution, financial assistance in emergencies, help with funeral costs, support for families when a breadwinner was arrested or killed. In the absence of any meaningful government presence, the Red Command became the government. This is the paradox at the heart of the Red Command story, and of organizations like it around the world. Its power was not purely coercive. It was also, in a genuine sense, social. People in the favelas did not uniformly fear the Red Command. Many of them, particularly in its early years, welcomed it, or at least accommodated it, because it delivered things they needed and the state did not. The organization understood this dynamic and cultivated it deliberately. In 1985, Escadinha carried out the escape that made him a legend. He was airlifted out of the Ilha Grande prison by helicopter, a breathtaking operation that required coordination, bribery, and the kind of meticulous planning that would have been impossible without the organizational infrastructure the Red Command had built. The escape was the lead story in Rio's newspapers for days. In the favelas, Escadinha became something close to a folk hero. 9 years later, in 1994, the state of Rio de Janeiro, under Governor Leonel Brizola, made the decision to demolish the Ilha Grande prison entirely. The building was imploded. The physical structure that had given birth to the Red Command ceased to exist. But by then, it hardly mattered. The organization had long since outgrown the island. It had chapters in multiple states, connections to Colombian cartels, a hierarchical structure that included chiefs, managers, soldiers, street-level dealers, communications operators, and lookouts. 7 distinct levels, according to later analyses by prosecutors. It had revenues that dwarfed what most small municipalities in Brazil brought in annually. It had become, in the assessment of some researchers, a transnational criminal organization operating with the internal logic and discipline of a corporation. The state had tried to destroy the Red Command by destroying its birthplace. It was like trying to put out a fire by knocking down the building where it started.
The Red Command today operates across more than 20 Brazilian states, with connections to criminal networks in multiple countries. Its leadership changes constantly. Arrests, deaths, and internal power struggles create a kind of permanent succession crisis at the top that the organization has learned to absorb. Its founding ideology of peace, justice, and liberty has been largely swallowed by the logic of profit. And yet, the organization retains, in communities across Brazil, a kind of social presence that no amount of law enforcement pressure has been able to fully erase. The story of the Red Command is, in the end, a story about what happens when a state abandons its obligations to its citizens. The favelas of Rio de Janeiro were not an accident. They were the predictable result of policy choices made over more than a century. Choices about who deserved housing, who deserved education, who deserved security, who deserved to be seen. The prison on Ilha Grande was not an accident either. It was the logical endpoint of a system that had decided certain people were beyond redemption, and that the cheapest solution was to warehouse them somewhere out of sight. Into the space left by those failures, something grew, something that offered identity, community, discipline, and belonging to people who had been denied all of those things by the society they lived in. That something was monstrous in many of its consequences. It has caused immeasurable suffering. It has killed thousands of people, and it emerged directly from the failures of the very institutions that were supposed to prevent it. That is the lesson of the Red Command, and it is a lesson that extends far beyond Brazil. Organized crime does not create the conditions that allow it to flourish. It moves into conditions that already exist, and until we reckon with what creates those conditions, no amount of law enforcement will be enough to make it disappear. The island is a nature preserve now. Tourists hike through the forest where the prison stood, looking at birds and waterfalls, sometimes not knowing or not thinking about what happened there. The walls are gone, but what they produced is still very much alive. If this story made you think, or if it made you uncomfortable, which is honestly the point, then hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. We cover real cases, real history, real consequences, and we do not sugarcoat any of it. And I want to hear from you. What do you think the real root cause of the Red Command's rise was? The prison system? The political climate? Or something deeper in Brazilian society? Drop your take in the comments. I read every single one.